Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Flamstead St Leonard's. For most of you, this is probably your home church, and it's kind of become a second home for me over the last 5 years, which is how long this project has now been running. The original idea behind this project was I was going to come along and I was going to look at the fantastic collection of medieval graffiti, of which this church has an abundance. And whilst we were looking at the graffiti, obviously you tend to look at the church in quite a lot of detail. So in fact, you look at the church stone by stone. In some ways, it's a very good way of ruining your perception of a building, because instead of seeing magnificent architecture, you start to see it instead as a collection of individual stones. Whilst we were doing that, we came to realise that the traditional story for St Leonard's perhaps needed some revision. And so we went on from doing the graffiti survey to actually doing a fabric survey. And what that meant really was going back and looking at the traditional story we've got for the construction here and seeing how that related to the fabric around us, and really trying to make sense of a building history. Now, the first thing to stress is that the building here it's pretty magnificent. This church is known for its early English decorated work. It's known for its fabulous wall paintings, and it's certainly known now for its medieval graffiti. But we still have this traditional narrative going back at least a century, which told us about the early history of the church. So one of our questions really, when looking at St Leonard's, was how much of that early story could we corroborate? How much of that early story could we actually say was here today in the fabric? And were we in fact seeing a slightly different story? And I'm afraid we had to conclude over the last 5 years that we are looking at something slightly different. So what I'm going to talk about today is really a new building history for St Leonard's. And also how our view on the building and the graffiti has changed over that time. You know, historical research is not something that's static. It's something that evolves as you go along. And the story of St Leonard's has most certainly evolved. So first of all, what is the traditional story? Well, the traditional story goes back now at least over a century, and it tells us that the current church was first built in the early 12th century. And it replaced an earlier timber chapel that dated back to before the Norman conquest in 1066. And in the 15th century, this clerestory, this upper section to the nave, was added, which caused the arcades here to distort and caused a lot of problems with this church. Problems that we have still been addressing during the recent project. Now, this church has had a lot of people who have looked at it over time. And they have come up with their own building histories. This is the plan that we had when we started the project. This really, all these different shaded areas here represent different building phases. And according to this, we were looking at a church which had Norman origins. And by that, the early architect was using something of a get-out clause. He wasn't going to do anything as crass as put a date to any of it. So he used instead architectural styles. And he used the term Norman. Today, we tend to think of that as what we call Romanesque. And then it moves on into the kind of early English period. But as you can see, this is a fairly complex building history. We've got the tower over here being built first. We've got buttresses being added on. The nave arcade here, that's a later period. We've then got later chancel. He wasn't sure what's happening over in the sacristy here, so he left it blank. And there's nothing wrong with that. Even today, having spent 5 years working on this church, I'm happy to say, and I'm quite open to say, there are certain areas here where I'm happy to say it's uncertain. We're not quite sure. They also looked at the architecture in 3D. So they took a very close look at these arcades and they came up with a very neat plan. And this really reflects a moment in time for this church. This was Flamstead St Leonard's in the late 19th and early 20th century. So really, we were taking it on to the next step. We were using this as a basis, and we were testing it. Is it correct, and can we learn anything new? Well, the first thing you do when you're looking at a church like this is go back and look at the pictures, because we all like to look at pictures. And when it comes to St Leonard's, we have a fine selection. So this is one of the earliest detailed images we have of St Leonard's. And this is the early 19th century engraving by Baron Longmate. And as you can see, it looks fairly similar to the church that we see today. There have been changes over here to the roof. If you look at the window here at the East End, it's very, very different from what we're seeing today. But in general terms, it looks, pretty much like the church we're seeing today. It's only the details that are changing. We then have a rather fine selection of early photographs. I'm not going to go into these in any detail because they all tend to be, they show a certain amount of detail, but again, little bits are changing all over the place. Now, the one man to whom we owe really our traditional story of St Leonard's is a previous vicar, the Reverend J.V. Bullard, M.A., who was here 1897 to 1909. Now, when he took over this church, it must be said, it was in a bit of an awful state. It needed really quite significant repairs. There were large areas where it wasn't watertight. There were large areas where the floor had rotted. There was certainly damage happening to some of the arcades. So the Reverend Bullard undertook oversaw a massive restoration of this building. And in doing so, he uncovered a lot of the early original fabric, bits and pieces that today actually we can't see. So here you see they actually scaffolded the whole of the tower. They did quite a lot of work to the tower itself. This is looking backwards, so this is looking towards the tower arch today. And as you can see, once you took off all of the render and the plaster, you could start to see a lot of detail. So bits I'll talk about later, you've got roof lines in there, and you've got these massive cracks coming down here. So Bullard really gave us this traditional story, and he, until this project came along, he probably was the person who knew most about this church because he had seen its bare bones. He had seen this church naked, as it were. And from that, he was able to develop his story. So when I came along to do this, I was doing exactly what Bullard was doing a century before me. But I was looking at the fabric perhaps with another century's worth of research behind that. And the first thing you do, really, is you start to stare at the walls. Now, obviously, staring at the walls when I'm doing a graffiti survey is something I'm pretty used to. But this time I was looking for different telltales. I was looking for different clues. And the first thing I noticed is looking outside. And I started to note that actually we had a lot of these. So ignore the red square, it's just there to demonstrate that you've got these three stones which are surrounding a hole, as it were, a hole that's now filled up. These are called putlog holes. And they are there and go back to when this church was first built. And they are called putlog holes because what you do is you put a log in them. And they are part of the original scaffolding for this church. So all the scaffolding would have been in timber. It all would have been lashed and nailed together. And you built the scaffolding as you went up. And you obviously wanted to secure it to the building. So you would build these little holes into which your timbers would slide. And when you'd finished building, you gradually brought the scaffolds down and you filled in your putlog holes. Now, a lot of the time, the outside of the church was probably going to be rendered, so you'd never see these again. But from these, you can start to work out, well, firstly, how many layers of scaffolding they had. And if you look at our sacristy or our vestry, you can suddenly see that we have these very neat putlog holes. And we have these very, very neat putlog holes all down the vestry and all the way down this aisle. And you can say that we actually have what we call 3 lifts on the scaffolding. So you've got the first one going in there, next one going in there, next one going in there. And if you imagine a platform running across here, then you'll be able to reach the top. So we know that that's actually built in 3 you've got 3 lifts there in the scaffolding. You can also start to see when you look at this, is that we've got lots of layers here. And you can start to work out exactly how many building courses you've got. Now, the thing about this is it's built in flint and lime mortar. And I'm really, really grateful today that outside in the churchyard, we have some people demonstrating building in flint and lime mortar. And if you go and talk to them afterwards, they will explain, how wonderful it is, but also the drawbacks. You can only build so high with flint and lime mortar before you have to stop and let it dry. And the reason is, if you carry on building, then the weight of the building material above will start to push out the mortar below, and it will actually weaken your wall. So we have these building phases, and you can start to pick them up. Actually, where is it? You can start to pick them up here. So these red lines, each of these represents a building phase. So, and I've probably missed out at least one in here and probably a couple of others in there as well. They've then also used in here and down in here, reused Roman brick. So we've actually got Roman building material being used here in a later medieval building. And they're using the Roman brick as a levelling course. So your flints, however good you are, there is still a sort of slight unevenness to it, but they're actually using this as a levelling course and a finishing course. So if you think of each of these being a building phase, and each one probably being a season's building work, then you can probably work out, near as damn it, how long it took to actually build these. So a lot of times if you go to a big medieval castle or something like that, they'll say, oh, this took hundreds of years to build, and it was, we had hundreds of men in here. A lot of the time that's not the case. Actually, we build these things far quicker than you might imagine. So this vestry is complete within a decade. Bodiam Castle down in Sussex, the most iconic of all castles, we know took only 16 years. So, and we can literally calculate that from the building phase. So we can start to get a sort of pretty clear understanding of exactly how long it took to build this. And that means that we can tie things down to a tighter period. You can do the same on the tower as well. Now, on the tower here, you'll note you've got much, I've probably missed out another one in there somewhere as well, but we've actually got quite large building phases in here, which makes me wonder if they hadn't taken out capping layers in between and then just carried on. So they'd cap it off over the winter, and then come the spring, they'd take off the capping layer and start again. So I wonder if we're not missing out a number of building phases here. So at the moment, we're saying the base of the tower, our early tower, which went up to that point there, probably took, well, we've got 6 different phases in there. We're probably missing a few in there as well. So again, a tower like that probably only took a decade. This is not something that's taking hundreds of years. So this is done in phases. And by looking at the fabric, we can start to say that actually this is taking this long, this is taking this long, this area over here has got put-log holes, this bit over here hasn't got put-log holes, so it's probably a different building phase. And from that, you start to end up with all these individual little areas of work. And then, of course, we have to do exactly the same with the inside. Now, this is obviously standing over by the toilets, looking back towards the main door there, and we're looking at this arcade here. Now, the traditional story here is that we've always known these arcades are a bit wonky. You don't need to look too closely. Anyone who's sitting near the arcades, just look up, and you'll see they are kind of slightly all over the place. What we really started to notice, though, was actually the way that some of these arches have been deformed. And they have been deformed quite radically. So when you start to look at the levels across here, you start to see just how far out some of the construction phases are. So this was actually done with a laser level. And so these lines represent a perfect level. And as you can see, over at this end, if you start at the top of that capital, by the time you get to this end down here, you're about 6 or 7 inches off. Even more interestingly, the top of the arches here, they aren't, by the time you get to that middle one, it's well off. Get back to this one, it's about 3 or 4 inches out. And if you look at this central arch, you'll see it's not even. Now, I think I actually stood in here, I think it was last year, with the vicar, and we stood back there, and I said, look across that arch and tell me what you see. And it was only when she stood there, she went, oh, it's not even, it's all off. Bullard noticed this back in 1905. And Bullard concluded that all of this deformation here, all of these changes in height, all of these changes in levels, was probably due to the weight of the Clare story when that was added. Now that's a good, we know this happens, buildings move, buildings subside. The problem was that when we looked in a little more detail, and in particular we look at the joints between all these stones, we realised actually that wasn't the case. These stones are in exactly the same position as when originally built. There has been no deformation on the arches themselves. There's been no major recutting and movement of these stones. That arch, which is off-centre, slightly wonky, has always been off-centre and slightly wonky. And it is the same across the church. So we've got these wonderful 2 arcades, and they've got this wonderful early English decoration carved on the capitals. They don't match. So the decoration on both sides is it's similar, but it is actually, when you start to look, you realise our 2 arcades are slightly different. So if you look at the depth of the arcade there and the depth of the arcade there, it's different. And when you get to the back of the church and you look at that pier there, it isn't opposite that pier there. And that pier there isn't opposite that pier there. And it's only by the time you actually get to this point that they are vaguely kind of opposite each other. So what's going on here is, this isn't being caused by the deformation. This is how it was built. And there's one final clue, and the clue is right next to where you are. All of you are sitting now. If you look at the pillar bases, right, the pillar bases on both sides, they are all the same height. You can run a laser level across those, and they are all exactly the same. They haven't moved. There has been no deformation. There has been no movement downwards. The Clare story has caused problems, and still causes us problems to this day, as we know, but it hasn't been the cause of this. This church was built this way. So that brings us to lots and lots of questions about why it was built this way. So we have to go back and we have to start looking at what the fabric is and what the fabric can tell us. Well, the first thing that the fabric can tell us is it's lacking somewhat. Most of the stone used here is what's known around here as Tottenhose stone. Tottenhose stone is not really much of a stone at all. It's a type of compressed clunch, a chalk. And it's brilliant for carving, as you can see. It's wonderful for decoration. It's absolutely rubbish if it gets wet. And what we know about this church is that over the last 500-600 years, there have been several periods where this has not been watertight. We know that there are several periods when the church has been in decay. And there have been a number of really quite significant rebuilding periods. So at various times, this church, the fabric, which is meant to be kept dry, has got really quite wet. It doesn't take away from the fact that this Tottenhose stone is probably one of the most wonderful materials to do decorative carving with. And the early English decoration here at St Leonard's is almost without equal. For a parish church of this size, they really went to town on it. And that leaves me with a lot of questions. So here we have some absolutely fantastic, top quality stone carving on piers that are wonky. What is going on? I wish I could give you a really good answer to that. I do not have a clear answer. All I can tell you really is about when they were built. But I think when it comes to all the deformation here, all the changes, all the odd arches, I think actually we have to go back to the Reverend Bullard again. And the Reverend Bullard already had the answer. If one dare sum up the causes of the dilapidated condition of the church before repair, they can be briefly expressed as 1, the choice of the wrong material for the particular design in the beginning, and since then, 2, neglect to keep the weather out of the walls. So the Reverend Bullard kind of had it pretty well summed up all the way back then. Now, the other thing we came to realise while doing the fabric survey here is that although Bullard had done a pretty good job, and his architect Cobb had done a pretty good job at working out some of the phasing in the church, they'd missed a bit of a biggie. And the bit of a biggie was the fact we had a rather extensive building phase taking place in the second half of the 17th century. Now, I personally think that Cobb and Bullard were much more interested in the medieval, right? So the 17th century really wasn't that interesting as far as they were concerned. But once we started looking at the church itself, we realized that we had all these different areas where there was very, very clearly 17th century work taking place. When you added it all together, you realize that actually what you had in the 17th century, second half of the 17th century, was another really quite extensive rebuilding, repair and construction phase to this church. And the most obvious place we could see this is actually on this aisle over here. And this is actually looking at the east face. Now, this wonderful sort of diaper work pattern here, this flint flush work, this is part of the 14th century original aisle that ran along that side. There isn't much of it, as you can see. That's all that's kind of left. The rest of this is all rebuilt, and it has these levelling courses again of brick. Now, the brick this time is not Roman, it is locally produced, and it is very, very, very distinctive. And you can see it here close up. You see all these white flecks along here. These are inclusions in the brickwork. It's like a shell. And you don't see this much at all, except for a few places, very, very close, in fact, to here. And the most obvious place, of course, is the almshouses across the road. If you compare the brickwork in the aisle here to the brickwork over in those almshouses, it is absolutely the same. The dimensions are the same. The inclusions are the same. And the wonderful thing about the almshouses, in fact, there you go, close up of the brickwork. The wonderful thing about the almshouses is they've got a date. We all know about the almshouses, and they've got a lovely date plaque, which is
1665.
There you go, because I forgot to put it on the PowerPoint. 1665. So what we can say is that the work that's being done on this aisle is being done about the same time as what is going on with the almshouses. And we also have the monument, of course, in here, which is the same family that built the almshouses. So, you know, quite possibly, this aisle is dilapidated at the time. They want to put a monument in here, so they rebuild at least one end of the aisle using this very, very distinctive brickwork. At the same time, of course, we also know that Flamstead gets a new ring of bells. Now, bells are expensive items. They're not something you pull out of your weekly wages. This takes many years of planning. And in a lot of churches, when they're getting bells done, particularly when they're doing repairs and things, they're doing it one bell at a time. Not here at Flamstead. They get almost a whole new peal of bells at the same time in the second half of the 17th century. And again, we have dates for those, which are slightly later than our rebuilding here. We also know that we actually, according to Cusson's History of Hertfordshire, the porch actually had a date stone in it, suggesting that there was a rebuild to the porch, and again dated to 1675. So when you take all this together, and we've also got work in the tower, which is using these same bricks, we know that we've got rebuilding of the tower, we've got rebuilding of the churches. This whole aisle along here is reconstructed at the same time, and they're spending a lot of money on these bells. So in the late 17th century, there is a major reconstruction and repair phase going on here. And that's new. We hadn't really put all those pieces together. And it ties in, of course, with what's happening in the village itself. So the church history is not a history in isolation. It reflects the history of the community around it. So when there are rebuildings, when there are repairs, you'll also see that you're seeing the same in the village. So there are quite a large number of houses here, still to this day, where we can see that significant work's being done in the late 17th century. And of course, again, tying in with Bullard's work in the late 19th and early 20th century, we're seeing exactly the same thing. So the church is simply a reflection of what is going on in the wider community. Now, the big question here, and the slightly controversial question over the last few years, has been our 12th century church. Where is it? And are we still seeing it? Are we seeing it today in the fabric of the church? Bullard and Cobb were quite convinced that they had an early 12th century church here. When I came here and looked at this to begin with, as Mark will tell you, I was never convinced we had an early 12th century church, simply because it did not fit. The earliest features we had were these Romanesque rounded arches. And then we know that we have a lancet window, which is one of these thin early windows, but that was actually a 13th century window. No one had ever suggested that was a 12th century window. So we knew that our earliest phase is the tower and what is going on in the tower. Now, the tower actually had a lot of clues all of its own. We knew it was Romanesque. We knew we had a Romanesque style going on in here. So it's what they equated back to the Norman work. But Bullard saw it in ways that I could never see it, because they stripped off all of this plaster. And Joe wouldn't let me do that. So, don't know why. But he had taken photographs, luckily. And the photographs for the time were actually pretty good quality. So what he had done is he had looked at the tower and he had identified a number of features. Firstly, he identified these fossilized gables. So you see we've got the red line and the blue line here. Cobb interpreted that as two earlier roof structures. So before the Clare story was put on. He had gone slightly further than that. He'd also identified these two massive cracks. Now, these massive cracks were early, and they are quite possibly the reason, or quite probably the reason, that this very, very large arch started to fail. And you can see on both sides where we've actually got damage. The cracks are still under that plaster, right? But you can see on both sides they've got damage. So what they did in the early English period is they infilled under the arch and they put this new, smaller, stronger arch in as a support. So, we knew that we had a Romanesque arch and we knew that we had an early English arch. And the only real question then became, what period was our Romanesque? Because, are we looking at early 12th century? Are we looking at very late 12th century? Well, again, we know that we've still got Romanesque up into about 2/3 of the tower. We've got these Romanesque, what were originally belfry openings. You can just see the heads out there today. Well, again, Bullard actually had the answer. So when I first looked at all of this information, all I could really say is that the tower is the earlier bit, and the tower is Romanesque in its at least the bottom 2/3. But I couldn't really say any more than that it was coming towards the transition period. So if you'd asked me a few months ago, what is the earliest phase of St Leonard's, I would have had to say somewhere between about 1170 and 1220. I don't think we've got our early 12th century church, but maybe we've got a late 12th century church. And then one more crucial piece of evidence came to light. In 1905, after most of the repairs were done, Bullard published a small pamphlet about the repairs themselves. And he included a number of other grainy photographs. And luckily, Mark sent me Bullard's report, and I was able to go through those photographs because some of them showed information that we couldn't see today. In particular, up at the top of that tower. Just where the red arrow is, hidden behind this clock face, they uncovered one of these carved capitals. Now, this carved capital, this single carved capital, was very, very distinctive. And where previously I would have had to say the Romanesque work here was somewhere between about 1170 and 1220, this capital is the distinctive piece of evidence. So this is what we call a trumpet scallop capital. It is very distinctive, it is quite uncommon, and it is very, very datable. And it is datable to the very, very end of that transitionary period. You can see the carving here is moving towards the sort of early English carving that we're actually seeing on these pier capitals here. So the dating evidence in the fabric appears to be telling us that our tower and our Romanesque work sits at the very end of that transitionary period. So we are looking at the period of about 1200 to about 1220, which I'm afraid to say makes our 12th century church look less likely. It doesn't mean there wasn't an earlier church on the site. It just means that we aren't seeing it in the fabric today. That, interestingly, of course, ties in rather perfectly with the documentary record, which is unusual in its own right. So the earliest written references to a church and priest in Flamstead both come from the early 13th century, supporting what we see in the fabric of the existing church. So there is the account of Matthew Paris, the Chronicle of St Albans, who notes the church in Flamstead in 1217. And then we also have a document contained in the Diocese of Lincoln records that lists the parish priests of Flamstead in 1223 to 24 as Thomas de Barsingham. So these earliest documentary records are actually kind of tying in with what we've got in the fabric itself. As I say, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a church on this site previously. It just means that we aren't seeing it today in the fabric. So where does that leave our new building chronology for Flamstead St Leonard's? Well, this is kind of it written down in short form, our earlier section, 1200 to 1220. Shortly afterwards, about 1230 to 1250, we've got the nave arcades being built and the original aisles and the north wall of the chancel. All of our aisles have subsequently been rebuilt on several occasions. The building on this side is different from the building on this side. They are of two very, very different construction phases. Our arcades are also subtly different as well. So that's 5 building phases already. I've only got to the second entry, ready? 1350, the east and south wall of the chancel, internal, and the east end of the north aisle. So this window over here is very distinctive. It is dated to about 1350, but the external fabric still has the same put-log holes, so that probably all dates from the 14th century. So I'm not going to go through to these in too much detail because it's easier to actually see it. So this was our original phasing plan that was put together by Bullard and Cobb back in the earliest 20th century. Our new phasing plan is somewhat more complex. And it really is, this church is not a simple story. This church is not just, a case of this was built then, this was rebuilt then, this was built then. As you can see, we have areas of multiple building phases with later repairs. So we know that in the porch over here, we've actually got modern repairs at the front. We know that the original is probably into the late 14th or 15th century, and actually it then sees a major reconstruction in the 17th century. We also know that there's quite a lot of 19th century repairs in there as well. So that porch, just that one part of the building, has 4 different construction phases. This is not an easy church to read. But once again, we can run through the basics. Our tower is definitely the earliest bit, and it probably does date to the period 1200 to about 1220. 1190 if you want to push it back into the 12th century, if you really feel that way. If you don't want to have to change any of the leaflets, right, that's fine. We're happy with that. Well, I'll let you go with that one. We then know that the arcades are built. We then know that we have this aisle. Most of the fabric here dates to about 1350. Then we have this blue phase here, which you'll see all over the place. The blue phase is also 14th century, but it's kind of uncertain date. So it is sometime in the 14th century. So if you combine our orange phase with our blue phase, you will see that St Leonard's actually is largely reconstructed in the 14th century. The arcades remain, but most of the shell is reconstructed then. You'll then see that you then have significant, well, you've got 15th century additions in your porch, in your stair turret going up to the rood loft up here, and in this porch here. You've also then got 15th century windows inserted into that aisle. Why they left that one? Possibly because it was a separate chapel, but this side, at the same time they add on the clerestory as well, so you've got a 15th century clerestory going on. So again, another massive rebuilding phase. The purple work, all down here, that belongs to the 17th century. And then, of course, you've got what happens in the 19th century, which is this green. And that is a major rebuilding of the outside of the chancel in the middle of the 19th century. And that's really interesting because what they do is they almost skin the building. So if you think back to the Longmate print and our rather stumpy 5-light window at the far end, it bears no relation to anything we see today because that window and virtually all of the outside of the chancel was rebuilt in the 19th century. The inside remains into our 13th and 14th century work, but the outside has been completely reskinned. So it's become a much, much more complex story. It's become a much more in-depth story, but it is still telling us and really reflecting, as I said, the story of what's going on in this parish. It goes through periods of repair, which we've just done again, and then periods of dilapidation. And then someone else comes along and they rebuild large sections of it. It's a story of plenty and dearth, really, of money and no money. And, it really is a reflection of your wonderful parish history. Now, that, I suppose, is where we've kind of taken the fabric so far. What we've also done, though, is we've rethought and we've looked again at some of the graffiti inscriptions in here. I cannot understate how wonderful the graffiti inscriptions here really are. There's all the churches like Ashwell they talk about, and Anstey they talk about, and Lydgate. As far as I'm concerned, Flamstead has some of the finest surviving medieval and post-medieval graffiti anywhere in the UK. It has unique inscriptions that are found in no other church anywhere. And really, apart from the usual grumpy faces and the rest of it, it's got some stuff here that we've been able to look at in detail, and thanks to this project, actually cross-reference with the documentary record. And that has begun to tell us a whole new story. A story that's as new as the way we're looking at the fabric. So first of all, what did we do? Well, we went around and we surveyed this place stone by stone. We looked at every individual stone that we could get to, and we recorded the graffiti inscriptions on them. This is a schematic of one side of the tower arch. Each of those numbers represents an individual graffiti inscription. The catalogue for this place now is over 500 pages long. This really is a monumental church when it comes to the graffiti. And we found just about everything you can possibly think of. So we actually found architectural inscriptions. Inscriptions such as this, which we, obviously are being created by people, they are masons or they are woodworkers. People are actually working on this church themselves. What we weren't able to do is tie too many of these into the fabric that we can see around us today. With the possible exception, I realise now, of this. This architectural inscription appears to show a 5-light window. And now if you think back to before the chancel is reconstructed and think back to that Longmate print, that's actually what we're seeing on the end of the chancel. So perhaps this does relate back to the original chancel window. We also found an awful lot of heraldry inscriptions all over the place, which we've been able to tie in. Most of these are fairly generic, but in a number of cases, we have actually been able to tie these in with the local lords of the manor as well. So some of these do reflect kind of real heraldry. We've also, move on, we've also came across this. This rather humble inscription is another unique inscription. This, all the scholars agree, this is showing musical notation. And this is showing medieval style musical notation, actually denoted by letters. And this is the only example that we have come across in graffiti anywhere in the UK. And of course, we've got our wonderful ship graffiti. Ship graffiti, we've got at least 2 examples now in this church. And, they've added to a much wider corpus, which is telling us a great deal about kind of ideas of faith and belief. And even the modern graffiti inscriptions are telling us something. Mr. H. Ellis, 1920, who left his mark on that pier over there. We actually think this is Hubert Ellis, who was a Flamstead resident and Borough Council deputy coroner in nearby Hemel Hempstead. So all of this is kind of adding to the story. But there is one big story, I suppose, with St Leonard, and it's one that we were able to kind of reassess as part of this project. And that is these inscriptions. All of you who know this church will know about these very, very deeply carved memorial inscriptions. They all date to the very, very late 16th century, and they all appear to be informal memorials. So for those people who couldn't afford to have their brasses or their big, elegant marble tombs, these are actually being carved into the piers themselves. The one on this pier over here, it reads, in this middle space, at this seat's end, there lieth buried our neighbour friend, old John Grigg of Cheverell's End, anno 1598, April the 15th. Now, when I first looked at these, I actually wrote an article on these ones, but when I first looked at these, this came across to me as kind of terribly sweet. I had this idea of old John Grigg kind of there in a wicker bath chair with a tartan rug over his nose, And once he went, his neighbours decided he should be commemorated here. Then, of course, I'm going to move. There we go. Third one, which we have down on the pier, or second one we have down the pier here, at this seat's end, in the middle alley, there lieth buried John Pace of the Bailey, anno 1596, June the 14th. Now, this isn't just telling us, of course, about John Pace. It's also telling us that in the late 16th century, they had benches in here because he's been buried at his seat's end. So the seat is essentially where you're sitting now. So John Pace of the Bailey is buried here, at our seat's end. Say hi to John. And then, perhaps the most heartbreaking and, oh, well, you can also see that these were, before they were actually cut in like normal graffiti, they actually marked out the pier with lines and then actually sketched out the words. So these weren't just something, someone didn't just come along, these were planned. They obviously couldn't quite keep the letters to form, but these were actually planned out. So these are kind of on that boundary between the formal and the informal. And lastly, of course, there was this inscription here. And it is kind of sad, I suppose. Within this pier, where, can't see it from that angle, sorry, where bricks are laid, there lieth buried a virgin maid. Frances Cordell was her name. She lived and died in godly fame, or goodly fame. Anno 1597, and that's June the 7th. So when I first looked at these inscriptions, I was under the impression that these were these informal memorials to the lower classes, that these were being done by their neighbours, they were being done by the parish clerk, perhaps, most likely, and that these were people who couldn't actually afford these other memorials. I actually published an article on it. This was in the church, the Bulletin of the Church Monument Society, and I was looking at informal memorials in churches across the UK, and one of the case studies I used was these 3 inscriptions here in St Leonard. And then, of course, the project progressed. And as part of this project, we actually had the services of Vicky Fletcher, an archivist from Worcester Archives. Wave, Vicky, put your hand up. There you go. So what Vicky did is she went and looked back at the original documents in the county record office. And she went back and she cross-referenced what we had on the walls with what's actually written in the parish registers. Now, I'm sure you can all read that. This is why we have an archivist, right? In fact, I know for a fact there are several people who can read that, which is, yeah. So what we have here is the burials in 1597. So we were trying to trace back our Frances Cordell. And we have entry 237 here, and it says the 7th of June, buried Frances Cordell, a young maid. And it goes on to say, Mr. Folke's daughter, buried in the South Alley. Mr. Folke's daughter. Suddenly, this started to take on a whole new light. Because the Folkes family, as I'm sure many of you know, in the late 16th century, were incredibly important locally. Not only are they lords of the manor, I think one of them ends up being Lord Chamberlain. I think it's Lord Chamberlain. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mark. Close to that. I can't remember which it is, but yeah. So these are incredibly important people. And yet Frances Cordell is being recognised as being daughter of one of the Folkes family. The suggestion here, of course, is that she is the natural daughter. So she is born out of wedlock, as it were. So suddenly, when you start cross-referencing the documentary records, we also find that John Pace and old John Grigg, they aren't these lovely old men with tartan rugs over their knees. They are, in fact, some of the busiest and most affluent members of the parish. Their children go on to be members of the local gentry. So far from actually reflecting the lower orders of society, these informal memorials, which are being carved into the piers by the parish clerk, are actually reflecting those parish elite, those people who in the next generation will have their marble monuments and they will have their brasses on the floor. And it completely changes the way we think about some of these inscriptions here. These are being produced on that cusp between the formal and informal, but they are being done for the parish elite. So whilst John Pace and John Grigg held small manors or large farms within the parish records make clear that the Virgin Maid, Frances Cordell, was actually the natural daughter of a member of the powerful local folk family. Now, lastly, because we have Birds of Prey shortly, which we're all excited about, this project over the last 5 years has really changed the way we think about this church. It's changed the way we think about the fabric. It's changed the way, in some ways, we think about the dating of it. It doesn't mean there wasn't an earlier church here, right, before I get lynched outside later. But it does mean it isn't really reflected in the fabric that we see today. The graffiti has also changed the way we think about this community through the centuries. This building has always been central to parish life. And I hope that thanks to this project, thanks to all the people, and thanks to the wonderful parishioners here, that it will continue to do so for centuries to come. Now, lastly, bearing in mind what Bullard said about the material here, can I just ask that over the next couple of centuries, you keep your gutters clean, okay? Anyway, thank you for listening.
I think what we just decided to do is, if you want to go and see the Birds of Prey, we're just going to ask Leslie. Where's Leslie? Where's she gone to? Leslie. Leslie's going to thank Matt formally, and then, rather unusually, we'll then do the questions after that. So if anyone wants to leave and go and see the Birds of Prey and not ask a question, they're very welcome to do that. Anyway, Leslie.
Thank you. Well, it's my great delight and pleasure to thank Matt, on behalf of the Heritage Project. But I just wanted to say that, with due respect to St Leonard, I've often thought of Matt as our patron saint, really, because he actually first came here, I think it was in 2019 or 2018, when he gave his first lecture on the graffiti. And we invited him before the project began to have a look at it and see, if it had got any potential, maybe, And of course it developed into the wonderful work he's since done on this church. And I have to say it has been an absolute eye-opener. I mean, we all know that old buildings are complicated. They are very complex. They have difficult building histories. And I think Flamstead's a perfect example of one of the most difficult ones you could try and unravel. Matt's brought his wonderful eye and his archaeological investigative skills onto the building and has been able to interrogate it, a bit like Hercule Poirot, and solve to a great extent, at any rate provide a convincing enough solution for some of the weirdness and anomalies that we see in this building. And I think we're hugely in his debt now for helping us to understand it better. A lot better. It's all beginning to make much better sense. And along with that, he's put it, through the work on the graffiti and through looking at the documents, he's put it into its social context so that we can see the building as something almost organic, that real people have built. We can see their records on the pillars. We're beginning to integrate it as part of the community, which of course is what a church is. So, fabulous. Thank you so much, Matt.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, and we now can look forward to understanding it much better.
Thank you, Leslie.
So, for those that are staying, are there any questions? Just give the...
Feel free to run.
Just give you a couple of minutes for those people off to see the Birds of Prey. Right, who was the first?
I'd just like to ask whether in your investigation you found any signs to ward off evil spirits or witches or that sort of thing.
Yes, what we call them are apotropaic marks, yeah, and we found hundreds. But you find those in kind of every church we look at. So an apotropaic mark is a mark that is designed to ward off evil. And if you think about it in terms of the medieval church, the most powerful apotropaic mark you've got is the cross. Right, because even to this day we still use the cross to ward off evil. And we've got an awful lot of examples here in St Leonard's. But we do find that it's a fairly common thing in a lot of churches. I would say you've got, I'm not saying there's something odd about St Leonard's, beyond the obvious. But there are an awful lot of them here, yeah. And we do have clusters of certain types of mark as well. But yes, exactly what we'd expect to see. And some really fine examples as well. So you shouldn't have too many problems with witches in the church. Don't hold me to that, obviously.
Thank you. I was just interested in, some of the pictures suggested that the buttresses on, like the tower, for example, they seem to be a slightly different style. Were they all built contemporary with the rest of the structure, or were some added later? I noticed in your plan that they all seem to be contemporary, but
well, this is when it comes to our 12th, 13th century tower. Did you know what I did there? So when we look at our early tower, those buttresses are integral, okay? But if you look at the buttresses, you then kind of go, which bit? Because there have been so many reconstruction phases on those. So I was sitting out there earlier having a coffee, just looking at the buttresses, and I can count at least 5 different phases of building and repair on one buttress. So there were certainly buttresses on our Romanesque tower. How much of the original fabric survives is open to question. And it's the same with all of our buttresses as you look around the outside. Most of those have seen very significant modern repair. But we know that they were replacing earlier buttresses as well. So on my phasing plan, you'll actually see that most of it is down as being modern, but it's probably replacing something earlier. So the thing about what I was doing is we can only go on the fabric that I actually see in front of me. So I can conjecture that there is an earlier buttress there, but I'm only recording the fabric I see. So we probably had buttresses in exactly the same places we see them now, probably in multiple construction phases. But just go and look at the tower. Just go and stand back, grab a coffee, spend 5 minutes looking at one of the buttresses of the tower, and then work out how many building phases you're actually looking at there. So I'm fairly sure we've got original buttresses, fairly sure there's not much of them left.
that's very interesting, because it suggests that if the buttresses had to be rebuilt a lot, they're rather vulnerable structures. Is that so? Is that generally the case?
Any exposed stonework is to a certain extent.
I see. Yeah.
So look at what's happened to the chancel. The outside of the chancel has been, on the east and the south side, has been almost entirely renewed. You won't really see any medieval material there at all. We know the inside is still in our 14th century, but the outside is completely renewed. And the stone around here, the stone is the problem. It's not great. Wonderful for carving, as long as you keep it dry. Anything on the outside is vulnerable.
Thank you. Him on this side? Yes, Leslie.
Just a quick thought, Matt. The inscriptions on the pillars and the fact that they're all late 16th century, they're Elizabeth's reign, time, as we all know, of considerable religious turbulence. She had to be very careful where she trod. And I do wonder whether there's some kind of response to the earlier iconoclasm that you'd seen in Edward's reign or something like that. That they are there because it was felt a little bit dangerous to erect a monument, as was done for Fuchs, of course, back in the chancel.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What we can say about those is that they are all probably the work of one man, and that the one man is the parish clerk, and it is our Firmin Adams chap. Because the inscriptions in the parish register that Vicky was looking at match, in many cases, the text that we're seeing on the wall. And they are using the same words, the same spelling, everything else. So it is likely they are all the work of one man. So whether that was a response to that, you are looking at the end of Elizabeth's reign there as well, or whether he felt this was something he could do. He may have been paid for it. You know, you've got to consider that. You know, could he have been earning a bit on the side by saying, yeah, I'll do you an informal carving in the church? We don't know. So it's difficult, because we know it's the work of one man, it's difficult to kind of equate that to any wider movement, as it were. You know, if we knew a bit more about him, you know, he would be a wonderful person to research if we find a bit more about him. But I'm not sure those records survive. So, but yeah, they are unique. You just don't see anything quite like that anywhere else in English churches, not like these.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Looking at the western end of the church, I sometimes look up there and wonder whether there is evidence of a musician's gallery having been there. I don't know if there's something to which there can be conceivably a definitive answer, but well, I just wondered whether you had thought of it.
Yeah, there is a gallery at one point. There is clearly a gallery or something going on up there. What we don't have a fixed date for, we know when there were, you know, there is evidence of a gallery. There's been so much work done up there that and it's all been replastered, that all we can take our evidence from is our little doorway up there and the fact that we've got cut-ins here, but some of that could be the result of deformation. Yes, I think there probably was. It would be a common thing to see in the 17th and 18th century, certainly. You see them in, you know, large-scale cathedrals as well. But the problem, as I say, is we can only kind of work on the fabric, and even there, the best evidence we had was actually from Bullard and his wonderful photos back in 1905. I wish he'd taken a few more in some respects. It may have, you know, told us a bit more. But yes, I think there probably was.
So maybe just one more.
My turn to be last. Bricks. You mentioned that some of the bricks are supposed to be Roman bricks.
Yeah.
I find that extraordinary, really. This was built at the earliest, as you said, in 1200. The Romans moved out of the country 700 years before that.
Yeah.
Are you saying that those bricks survived, those Roman bricks survived for 700 years and then were stuck on the side of our church when they built it?
Have you been to St Albans recently?
Yes.
The Abbey's built of Roman brick.
Yeah.
This, you know, you had the Roman town here, Verulamium. It was a massive building site. If you wanted Roman brick, and if you wanted brick, then you could just go down and help yourself. They built, you know, the Abbey at St Albans is built out of Roman brick. There's a lot of Roman brick around here because it's like Roman pottery. There is just tons and tons of it about. And it's a really useful building material. So yes, we actually see it quite a lot. And you see it across East Anglia as well, where we've had lots and lots of papers published on people who've been going around just looking at all these churches that contain Roman brick. This part of Hertfordshire and East Anglia, we don't have much in the way of natural stone, apart from flint and your topmost stone, otherwise is compressed chalk. So a good supply of brick for use in things like levelling courses or coins, well, why make new ones when the Romans have left you 1 million tons worth just lying around the place? And there was certainly enough to build the Abbey at St Albans, and many of the other churches around here have all got Roman brick in, and it's really distinctive. So when you see it, you recognise it. So we've got levelling courses. If you go outside and look at the vestry, we've got the levelling courses there are all Roman brick. Or Roman tile, as we call it. And yeah, there was a lot of it lying about. And it's like Roman pottery. We were working on an excavation down in Smallhithe quite recently. We just came across another Roman site while looking for some medieval. We pulled a ton, 1 metric ton of broken Roman pottery out of this excavation. Right? So either the Roman Empire was the clumsiest empire in history, and I'm not ruling that out. Yeah, they were mass producing, and they were producing brick, pottery, tile, all of that on such a large scale that yes, when St Leonard's is being built and they want building material, nip down the road, tons of it, mate, and you can get it for free.
Okay, well, I can see the crews waiting outside patiently to set up for this evening's concert, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. But Matt, thank you again ever so much.
Absolute pleasure.